Hello, it's nice to see you again, or maybe I should say to not see you again. Um, I wanted to sort of just take stock quickly of where we stand in terms of press coverage of politics. Obviously, this is the stretch run, the final week before the election. We may or may not have firm results on election night. We'll just have to wait and see about that. But there are a few things I want you to keep your eye on. One, as I said more than a week ago, is the various battles for the Senate. There are six, depending on which news organization you look at, there are between 6 and 10 states with very, very close races. It's not worth at this point getting into who's leading in which one because some of the polling is quite up to date and some of it is not up to date. For example, I've been trying to follow the Montana Senate election, and Montana is not a very populated state, and there's not a whole lot of polling that goes on. And short of going out and reading Montana newspapers, most of which are too small to do any scientific polling, there really isn't a lot to go on. So I think we're just in wait and see mode in a number of states, and this is very important because essentially a president needs control of the Senate and the House to be able to put through his policies. And if President Trump should be reelected, but if the Democrats win the Senate, he will have a very hard time getting anything done legislatively. If President Biden wins, but the Republicans retain control of the Senate, it'll be very hard for him to enact his program. So I think that we, sort of want to look at the election results in that context. I think that journalists are often in a peculiar position in the last week or two before an election. On the one hand, they're trying to keep readers and viewers up to date. But what does up to date mean? It's as if you were covering a baseball game and telling people about every pitch, or if you were, a conductor on a railroad yelling out every stop. People who want that information can go online and find it at some of the sites that track politics very, very closely. I think I have mentioned one of them, 538.com, 538.com, which was founded by Nate Silver, who used to work for the New York Times, and then he sort of went out on his own. And it's a real repository of polling data and stories about the elections. I think in the last presidential election, he was more accurate than anyone else, though that's not to say his polls were accurate. But so we have a lot of coverage of polling, and some of the big polls are polling frequently, and some of the compilations of polling. And 538 runs one. The Economist magazine is publishing one as well. And there's a site called realclearpolitics.com, realclearpolitics.com, that every day presents an average of all the credible polls that it can find. So that's one aspect of the campaign. At the same time, journalists are trying to come up with original stories that will attract attention and news if there's any news. But there isn't, at least to my eye, a whole lot of political news at this point. The candidates are traveling. Sometimes they're changing their travel plans. Sometimes they're turning up unannounced. But we're not really clear what the impact of any of these visits are. Is having a rally going to change anybody's mind? Probably not. Is it going to encourage people to vote? Maybe. And that's sort of the big unknown between polling and results, and is reflected in journalistic coverage of this uncertainty about when you're polling, are you polling a sample of the whole population? Probably not. Generally, polling companies either look at polls of registered voters, or they filter that further by asking people first if they're likely to vote. And there's always a gap between how many are registered and how many are likely to vote. And so the best polling, or the most accurate polling, is that based on people who identify as being likely to vote. Even that, I mean, there's an even broader category of eligible to vote. So you sort of have eligible to vote is the broadest category, then registered to vote, and then likely to vote. And compared with many nations, turnout in the U.S. tends to be low, where generally speaking, about half of the eligible voters do not vote. For a variety of reasons, and journalists have been writing stories about why aren't people voting. I think locally in the Baruch community, I think the Ticker and Dollars and Cents are both trying to do articles on students who report that they won't vote. So, we're all sitting here wondering what will happen in the next week. There's news of the campaigns. There are attempts to manufacture news. And there are a lot of other issues going on that are in the news, not directly related to the election at this point, like the confirmation of a new conservative Supreme Court justice yesterday, establishing a clear conservative majority on the Supreme Court. That is momentously important for the United States and its people. But whether it will have any impact on this election, is not clear. It's not clear what challenges about counting votes will continue to be brought to the court. If you've been following the news, you've seen that several states' procedures are being challenged one way or the other. We don't know how the new justice will vote on some of those. There was a decision last week, about a Republican attempt to throw out some of the changes in the voting procedures in Pennsylvania. The challenge was defeated by a 4-4 vote. Will this new justice make a difference? Will she vote on political issues? Just having been appointed a week before the election, will she vote the way the conservatives hope or the president hopes? We don't know any of this. If you just sort of think about this historically for a minute, the Chief Justice at the time of Brown v. Board of Education, the great desegregation case, the Chief Justice was Earl Warren, who was a Republican and been appointed by President Eisenhower, who was a Republican, and it was anticipated that he would be conservative, and yet he turned out to be quite progressive on some social issues. So we just don't know, but that's a story on everybody's minds. There are other stories pertaining to the president that are in the news. There was a ruling just this morning or yesterday by a court judge that blocked the Justice Department from interceding in a rape charge case filed against the president before he became president in New York State Court. The Justice Department was trying to move it to federal court and represent the president there, even though this was an act that took place before the presidency. It really has nothing to do with the election, but it was front page or homepage headlines on all the news sites this morning. So you sort of have to look at the news with a sophisticated eye and ear and say, what's important to me? What do I really want to follow? What's going to make a difference? What do I want to watch? And whom do I trust for news? And as always, I say, a mixed news diet is best. In the run-up to the election and on election night, I'm constantly changing among the channels. Each network on election night has what it calls, sometimes by a different name, the decision room, where they have analysts working, analyzing the returns, and then telling journalists. And whatever you may think about Fox's politics or Fox News's slant, in the last 2 or 3 presidential elections, their decision room has been the most accurate, the quickest to call the most accurate results. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind, whatever your political views, and pay some attention to it as well as to any other news sources. I think it's also hard, and I've brought this up before. I wanted to say we've discussed it, but we've had some back and forth about it, is sorting out the cheerleading from the actual journalism. And it's very hard at this time of year, and a lot of journalists clearly favor one candidate or the other. And we are looking at the coverage and saying, is this fair? Is this balanced? And in many cases, the answer is no. And if you want fairness and balance, you need to read multiple sources and get different perspectives. I think there are also a lot of local elections. They're getting very little attention. There was an interesting story yesterday in the Times about AOC, and it mentioned that she's running for re-election in the House of Representatives, as every member does every 2 years. And she's regarded as a very clear favorite in this race. And yet she has received $30 million in donations, far more money than she needs to spend on this campaign. And why is that? And I think it's because she has successfully portrayed herself and been embraced as a spokeswoman for the progressive movement and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So you can look for elections that you're interested in that seem to have a resonance outside of the actual district. There's so much tumult going on, and I don't know what to expect. I would just be very happy if next Tuesday night at bedtime, or that probably will be Wednesday morning, if we know the outcome. We may not. There are some states that won't have completed their count. There are some states where the count will be completed, but there may be legal challenges to it. And so there's just, I think, a lot of uncertainty surrounding this race now, and more so than in previous years, because of the pandemic and the way it's changed how people vote and the number of people who are voting in advance. And just to repeat something that you've probably read or heard somewhere else, there are some states that count the early voting and mail-in ballots received as they come in. And then there are some, and I think Pennsylvania is one, where by law they're not allowed to count the early ballots or the mail-in ballots until the polls close on election day. So that means they won't even be beginning the count until mid-evening on Tuesday. And if it's a big state, as Pennsylvania is, there's very little likelihood we'll have any results at midnight on Tuesday. I think that's realistic to say that. So no one really knows what to expect. A great deal has been made in news coverage of voter intimidation and voter harassment and attempts to disqualify voters. It's hard sometimes to assess how much of that, if there's a gap between the rhetoric and the reality, and are journalists getting caught in that gap and fishing for stories. It's hard to say. And, I think we just have to wait and see. I think that the story from the New York Times that I emailed you yesterday, Ben Smith's article about what a wonderful job the Wall Street Journal had done, was an important one. And there was a concept that it brought up that I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about, and that is the gatekeeper role. And if you've taken our Journalism 2500 or in other media and society classes or communications courses, there is communications theory that gives the mass media the role of a gatekeeper. And what this means is if you think of a communication spectrum, excuse me, where on one end you have a sender, and on the other end a receiver, or in nature, this might be called stimulus and response. But in the middle, you have a gatekeeper, or maybe more than one keeper, who decides which messages get through and which parts of the message. And this is a role that the news media, in any of its forms, represents, because it decides what to publish, whether it's in print or on its website. It decides what to broadcast. Certain things squeeze out other things. And so, there is this gatekeeper responsibility. Now, to some extent, maybe to a large extent, the internet has made this less important because there's so many sources of news. And it's so relatively easy for any of you at home to hop around the country or hop around the world reading different news sites. And I hope you do that. I know I do that fairly regularly. But nonetheless, when you look at the most influential and important papers, and in the United States, most people would agree that those are not necessarily in order: the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. The Times and the Journal have a circulation in excess of 1 million. So does USA Today, for that matter, though it's regarded as less influential. But the decision to cover a story or not cover a story means you're sort of deciding, is it going to be on a million people's breakfast tables the next morning or not? And I think it was heartening to see the Wall Street Journal cautiously evaluate some information and decide not to proceed with the story until they could confirm more of it. And I know that as of this morning, they still have reporters and a couple of editors working on this material, trying to figure out what exactly the they're not charges, the assertions about Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, amount to. There's been no legal action to guide them, but they're going very slow on printing this because they want to be very careful. That, I think, is commendable and maybe somewhat rare, as decisions are made against the backdrop of, will the competition have this? Will we get beat? Will we lose audience to someone who is printing it? So I thought it was interesting on that front, and we've now in consecutive weeks seen the Times publish articles very critical of its own coverage and now praising a competitor. So I think that that's, just the kind of vibrant discussion and diversity of opinion you want to see within a newsroom and a news report. We'll see how that plays out going forward. I think it's a very exciting time and a very confusing time. I haven't gone back and looked at your transcripts and determined, actually, I don't know if your transcripts have your date of birth. I don't know how old many of you are. This, for many of you, I think this is probably your first presidential election, first presidential election as an adult in the United States. For some of you, maybe your second. So that in itself is very exciting. And if you're eligible to vote and registered to vote, I hope you will vote one way or the other. I know my wife and I were just looking at schedules of early voting in Westchester and where we can vote when. I'm sort of allergic to standing in line, so we're trying to figure that out by time of day. So as I said in my email yesterday, I did not assign specific articles this week aside from the Ben Smith column that I mailed you, because I think so much of the news, whatever your news source is about political coverage and politics. So I hope you're getting a lot out of it. if you have any questions or any thoughts, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And then with the election next week, we'll begin the transition to looking at policy issues and coverage of those policy issues. I wanted to mention that in the syllabus, I had said that either last week or this week, I hope to be joined by Greg Birnbaum, who is the politics editor of NBC News and who is an adjunct for us. And we've been unable to figure out a way to do it because he's working about 140 hours a week and has been for a few months. And we couldn't figure that out. So I'm sorry about that. It's possible we might be able to get him for a post-mortem, depending on how much clarity we have. And if I were able to do that, my plan would be to set up a time when I would talk to him, have a conversation, and let you all know. So if you wanted to join on Zoom, you could. But at the same time, we would record that conversation, and those of you who are unable to join it would be able to listen to it afterwards. I hope everything is going well, that you and your families are staying safe, and I hope you're wearing masks when you go out. And we'll be in touch again next week. Please, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. If you want to have a conference or just an informal conversation, please send me an email and I will get back to you with potential times. I'm very happy to do that if you're interested. So thank you for your time and be well.